6,000 dead in 3 hours, or 3,002. The number changes depending on who tells the story. Hernán Cortés offered one figure. Later chroniclers offered others. Indigenous accounts preserved a different memory of the violence. 5 centuries later, no ledger can tell us exactly how many bodies lay in the courtyards and streets of Cholula. But the disagreement over the number does not make the massacre less real. It makes the event more disturbing. Because somewhere inside those competing stories is a question that has never stopped following the conquest of Mexico. Did Cortés uncover a plot to destroy his expedition? Or did he invent the plot he needed in order to terrorize an entire world? In October of 1519, Cholula was not simply another city on the road to Tenochtitlan. It was one of Mesoamerica's great sacred centers, a destination for pilgrims and merchants, a city dominated by the immense pyramid later known as the Great Pyramid of Cholula. Its priests guarded a religious prestige older than the Mexica power centered in Tenochtitlan. Its rulers also occupied dangerous political ground. Cholula had close ties to the Mexica and a bitter rivalry with neighboring Tlaxcalan. Into that city came Hernán Cortés with several hundred Spaniards, indigenous porters, Totonac allies from the Gulf Coast, and a growing coalition whose most powerful new members were Tlaxcalans. The coalition is the first truth the old conquest legend tried to hide. This was never a story of a few hundred Europeans defeating millions by themselves. Cortés survived because he entered a landscape already divided by tribute, rivalry, ambition, and accumulated grievance. He did not create every fracture, he learned how to use them. Only weeks earlier, that skill had nearly failed him. When the expedition entered Tlaxcalan territory, it was not greeted as a liberating army. Tlaxcalan forces attacked. For days, Spaniards and their allies fought under punishing pressure. Horses, steel, firearms, and disciplined formations gave Cortés advantages, but they did not make his men invulnerable. They were far from the coast, short on secure supplies, and surrounded by opponents who understood the land better than they did. A serious defeat could have ended the expedition before Tenochtitlan ever appeared on the horizon. Tlaxcala itself was not a modern republic governed by a single senate, as it is sometimes described. It was a confederated political world formed around several major altepetl, or city-states, whose leaders did not always agree. Xicotencatl the Younger favored continued resistance. Other rulers saw a different opportunity. The Mexica had failed to conquer Tlaxcala, but generations of hostility and economic pressure had made the conflict costly. An alliance with these dangerous outsiders might break the balance. The decision was strategic, not submissive. The Tlaxcalans were not dazzled by white gods. They had already fought the newcomers, wounded them, and learned that they could bleed. Nor were they joining a Spanish plan whose final shape they could clearly see. Each side believed it might use the other. Cortés wanted a road into the basin of Mexico. Tlaxcalan leaders wanted power against their regional enemies. The alliance began with calculation. It would end by remaking the continent. Cholula was its first terrible test. The surviving narratives disagree almost from the moment the coalition approached the city. In Spanish accounts, Cholulan representatives first tried to avoid a formal meeting. When Cortés insisted, the expedition entered. The Tlaxcalans, hated by the Cholulans, were largely kept outside or camped nearby. Inside, the Spaniards received lodging and food. Then the mood changed. Supplies became scarce. Important leaders seemed to disappear. Warnings reached the expedition that barricades had been prepared, that holes had been concealed in the roads to injure horses, and that Mexica warriors waited nearby to attack as the column departed. To Cortés and his captains, every closed door could now hide a weapon. Every quiet street could be the mouth of an ambush. There may have been a plot. There may also have been military preparations inspired by fear of the strangers already marching with Cholula's enemies. The evidence cannot settle the question with certainty, because much of the story comes from men who had every reason to justify what they did next. The most famous warning centers on Malintzin, the Nahua woman the Spaniards called Doña Marina, and later generations called La Malinche. She had been enslaved and transferred to the Spaniards after fighting in Tabasco. Because she spoke Nahuatl and Maya and soon learned Spanish, she became far more than an interpreter. She made negotiation possible. She carried threats, read political meanings, gathered intelligence, and spoke in rooms where the expedition's future was being decided. According to the later account of Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a Cholula noblewoman secretly urged Malintzin to escape. The Spaniards, she allegedly said, were about to be destroyed. Malintzin pretended to accept the offer, encouraged the woman to speak, then reported the warning to Cortes. It is a brilliant scene. Quiet voices, concealed intentions, one woman testing another while an army waits in uncertainty. It is also a story written down decades after the event. We cannot watch it as if a camera were present. We can only say that Spanish narratives used the warning as crucial evidence of a conspiracy, and that Cortés chose to act before any supposed ambush could occur. He summoned Cholula's rulers, priests, and fighting men to enclose spaces near the quarters occupied by the expedition. Then he accused them of treachery. What followed was not a battle between two armies arranged on open ground. The Spaniards attacked people gathered at close range. Their indigenous allies joined the violence as it spread. Tlaxcalan forces entered a city they regarded as an enemy and settled grievances the Spanish did not fully control. People were killed in courtyards and streets. Buildings and temples burned. Looting followed. Some inhabitants resisted. Many had little chance to organize before the killing began. Cortés later claimed that approximately 3,000 people died in about 2 hours. Other traditions raised the toll to 6,000. Neither figure can be independently verified. The honest conclusion is colder than a dramatic certainty. The dead numbered in the thousands, and the people responsible also helped produce the records used to explain why the killing had been necessary. That is why Cholula cannot be understood only as a response to intelligence. It was also exemplary violence, a public lesson written in bodies. Cortés needed allies to believe that joining him could destroy their enemies. He needed hostile cities to believe that resisting him could bring catastrophe. He needed Moctezuma's messengers, wherever they were watching from, to carry one message back to Tenochtitlan. This coalition was willing to cross limits that diplomacy had failed to contain. Yet the popular image of Cholula as a city erased in a single morning is also misleading. Cholula was not permanently reduced to ash. After the massacre, Cortés imposed a settlement, dealt with surviving leaders, and continued his march. The city endured, although its political order and relationship with the Mexica had been violently altered. Terror did not annihilate Cholula. It forced it into the new balance of power moving toward the basin. Nor was the massacre the work of Europeans alone. Spanish weapons and Spanish command were central, but Tlaxcalan participation mattered. That fact does not erase Cortés's responsibility. It reveals why the conquest was so difficult to fit into a simple story of foreigners against natives. Indigenous peoples were not one political body. They made choices under pressure, pursued older conflicts, and attempted to survive a crisis whose ultimate consequences none of them could fully predict. When the coalition left Cholula, it carried more than weapons and supplies. It carried a reputation. Ahead rose the passes between Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. The air thinned, the temperature fell. Then the mountains opened, and the basin of Mexico appeared below. The sight must have seemed impossible. Lakes reflected the sky, towns crowded the shores, canoes moved through a network of waterways. At the center stood Mexico Tenochtitlan and its sister city, Tlatelolco, joined to the mainland by long causeways. Temples rose above white buildings. Markets circulated goods from distant regions. Agricultural produce flowed toward the capital from highly productive Chinampa zones, rectangular raised fields built within shallow lake environments, not gardens floating loose upon the water. Estimates of Tenochtitlan's population vary widely, from tens of thousands to well above 100,000. The precise number matters less than what confronted the expedition. One of the largest and most complex urban centers the Spaniards had ever seen. It was magnificent. It was also defensible. The causeways were narrow approaches across water. Bridges could be removed. Canoe fighters could attack from both sides. If the Mexica closed the routes behind the coalition, Cortés's men would be trapped inside a lake city whose people vastly outnumbered them. Cholula had made the Spaniards look unstoppable. Tenochtitlan exposed the truth. They had marched into a place capable of swallowing them whole. On November 8, 1519, Cortés met Moctezuma II on the southern approach to the capital. Nobles accompanied the Huey Tlatoani, the supreme speaker of the Mexica imperial system. Rich cloth, flowers, feathers, polished stone, and gold gave the encounter a ceremonial grandeur the exhausted invaders could barely comprehend. Malintzin stood between the two leaders, carrying words across languages and political worlds. For centuries, one explanation claimed that Moctezuma believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl. There is no reliable contemporary evidence that he welcomed the Spaniard as a god. That story grew stronger after the conquest because it made a complex political disaster appear inevitable. It turned indigenous calculation into superstition and Spanish aggression into destiny. Moctezuma's welcome was not necessarily surrender. Hospitality could be a form of control. By housing the newcomers in the palace associated with his father Axayacatl, he placed them in comfort, but also in a location he could observe. He could learn what they wanted, delay open war, protect the capital from an immediate clash, and test whether gifts and ceremony could contain them. Cortés faced the opposite problem. Every day inside the city increased his knowledge and his danger. The Spaniards could see wealth, temples, armories, and crowds. They could also see the bridges behind them. They were guests only as long as Moctezuma allowed the fiction of friendship to survive. Then news from the Gulf Coast provided Cortés with an accusation. A clash had occurred near the Spanish settlement at Veracruz. Qualpopoca, a Mexica official in the coastal region, had fought Spanish forces and their Totonac allies. Juan de Escalante, the Spanish commander at Veracruz, was wounded and died. Cortés claimed Moctezuma bore responsibility. Again, the sources bend around the needs of the men telling the story. Cortés later described the ruler's transfer to Spanish quarters in language designed to make coercion resemble consent. Bernal Diaz offered a harsher picture. Armed captains surrounding Moctezuma, while Cortés demanded that he come with them. When the ruler resisted, the threat beneath the conversation became unmistakable. Within days of entering Tenochtitlan, the guests took their host hostage. The scene did not require Cortés to shout a theatrical order of execution. His violence was already visible. Moctezuma knew what had happened at Cholula. The armed men in his chamber knew he knew. Their demand carried the memory of a sacred city where an accusation had been followed by mass killing. Moctezuma finally agreed to move into the Spanish quarters. He told his people that the decision was voluntary. Outwardly, he remained the Huey Tlatoani. He received nobles, issued commands, participated in state affairs, and occupied a position of enormous symbolic authority. But Spanish guards controlled his immediate surroundings, and Cortés now used access to the ruler as leverage over the capital. Calling Moctezuma a powerless puppet, however, goes too far. A ruler is not only the room in which he sleeps. He still possessed relationships, ritual status, information, and supporters. The Spaniards had captured his body without capturing the entire Mexica political system. They had created a hostage crisis inside a functioning imperial capital, and then mistaken temporary paralysis for permanent control. Why did thousands of warriors not attack at once? Because empires do not react as a single mind. An assault could kill Moctezuma. Nobles disagreed over policy. The strangers still carried the protection of guest status, however damaged. Their indigenous allies complicated any attempt to isolate them. And Moctezuma may have believed that time, negotiation, or controlled pressure could still solve a danger that immediate war might make worse. None of those possibilities makes him weak. They make his position tragic. Every option threatened the state he was trying to preserve. Cortés had transformed fear into access, and access into captivity. But he had not conquered the city. The illusion would collapse in 1520. While Cortés was away confronting a rival Spanish expedition, Pedro de Alvarado ordered another massacre during the festival of Tlaxcalan. Tenochtitlan rose. Moctezuma died under circumstances that remain disputed. The Spaniards and their allies attempted to escape by night and suffered devastating losses on the causeways in the retreat remembered as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. That disaster exposes the weakness in the legend of effortless conquest. Cholula did not make Cortes invincible. Taking Moctezuma did not place an empire permanently under Spanish command. Tenochtitlan would fall only after Cortes rebuilt his coalition, after smallpox tore through communities with no immunity to the disease, and after a brutal siege in which enormous indigenous armies fought on both sides. So what did Cholula truly accomplish? It opened the road to Tenochtitlan, not by removing every enemy, but by changing what every observer believed was possible. It demonstrated that the newcomers and their allies could turn negotiation into entrapment, accusation into punishment, and local rivalries into a weapon larger than any cannon. The massacre gave Cortes a language of terror. Days later, inside Moctezuma's chamber, he did not need to repeat it aloud. The ruler of Tenochtitlan had already heard the message, and that may be the darkest connection between the courtyard at Cholula and the palace of Axayacatl. The first event killed thousands. The second needed only the memory of what had happened to them. Was the alleged Cholulan ambush real, exaggerated, or manufactured? Did Moctezuma's caution briefly save his capital, or give Cortes the opening he needed? Tell us which decision you believe changed the course of the conquest. This is the History Ledger, where empires are not legends, and every victory leaves a shadow in the record.